Welcome back to another episode of I Wish They Knew, a show where we share big ideas that deserve more attention in about the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. I'm Joe Hirsch. Today's wish comes from Michael McQueen. Michael is a multi-award winning speaker, change strategist, and best-selling author of 10 books. He's been named Australia's Keynote Speaker of the Year and was inducted into the Professional Speakers Hall of Fame. His latest book, and it's a good one, is Unstuck, Mastering the Art of Changing Minds. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let me ask you, what do you wish more people knew, especially when it came to changing minds?
I think that the thing I'd love people to know is that when we think we're changing people's minds, we're often appealing to the wrong mind. And that, we're often using sort of 18th, 19th, 20th century techniques for changing people's minds in the 21st century and wondering why we're getting nowhere. And in fact, we're increasingly polarized and entrenched in our views. And the harder we're pushing, the more we try and persuade, often the more it's backfiring. I'd love people to know why that's happening and how to actually have more productive and fruitful conversations.
So our instinct is, when trying to change someone's mind, to push more facts, to push more figures. And if only people could see things the way we see things. Why is that backfiring on us?
Yeah, well, you look at where this sort of comes from historically. So a guy named Francis Bacon, who is one of the founding fathers of the Enlightenment, his big idea was that essentially humans are reasonable. And so that if you want to try and educate or influence someone to change their mind, you've got to give them enough evidence and logic and essentially educate them to the point where they see the light, they see reason and change their mind. And that really shaped the next few centuries in terms of the way we approached academia, even scientific method. The problem is it's not true. And what we've discovered in the last few years, particularly the last 15 to 20 years from a neuroscience standpoint, is that when someone is rigid or stubborn in a certain way of thinking, and this can be around political or ideological stuff or in a team, stuck in a way of operating or working in their role or in the team, the more you try and push with evidence and logic, the more stubborn they become. And I think everyone listening has experienced that, whether it's, uncle such and such in your family or someone on your team, or sometimes influencing up your boss who just cannot see or think about a different way of doing things. And so, the challenge is we often make the best business case, we give all the best logic, and yet it falls on deaf ears or sometimes does more harm than good. And that's incredibly frustrating. And we see this particularly today around political polarization. And, over time, it's actually doing a lot of harm to our families, our communities, to the notion of democracy. And so we've got to find a better way to try and come together and actually influence each other and start listening and learning from each other. And that's easier said than done.
Yeah. So instead of pushing harder on the issues, we need to really push aside the hard issues that are getting in the way of people adopting a different way of thinking. And one of the ways to get people to upgrade their beliefs, you say in the book, and I love the way you put this, it's to allow people to save face, but also to make space. And I want to cover both of those things. Let's start with the saving face, because one of the big reasons why people refuse to change is because doing so is an admission that they're wrong. And no one wants to be wrong, right? So how do we make it safe for people to see things differently?
And I love the word safe, because it wrapped up in the notion of safety is that idea of dignity, allowing people to save face and not feel like they have to acknowledge they were an idiot in order to admit they may have been wrong or just not seen the full picture previously. And yet we often back people into that corner. And so we've got to look at what it is that tends to trigger that defiance and the ego state that makes us want to dig our heels in because we're embarrassed or ashamed. And it's funny how we've had this notion for so many years that humans are just afraid of change. And we say that so often, you assume it's true because we hear it so often. It's almost like a truism. And yet, interestingly, again, from a research perspective, what we've discovered in the last few years is that's not true. Humans aren't afraid of change or afraid of loss. And so one of the biggest losses that makes people dig their heels in is that sense of a loss of dignity or pride, the fact that I'm losing face or maybe losing some autonomy or control in the process of changing. So therefore, if you want to get people to willingly embrace change, how do you put it in a context that helps them make sense of it and go, you know what, this is actually similar to something I already agree is true. You've reframed it in a way that now feels familiar. Or you get them to a point where they feel like they're in control of the change. You give them a choice over the process of changing to the point where they feel like they're in the driver's seat. Agency is a big part of this. And you see this in the workplace essentially. But I think the goal is you've got to help people get to the point where they feel they can change by feeling it was their own idea, rather than because they felt bullied or coerced. And yet so many of us go into an argument or a debate with this unconscious zero-sum game approach of I'm going to win and they're going to lose. They're going to hoist the white flag of surrender and go, you know what? You are so right. I can't believe I was such a fool. And like, when has that ever happened in anyone's life? It just doesn't happen, whether that's with your kids or at work or in society broadly. So it's trying to allow people to, I love that phrase, save face and give them space. It's such a good way of putting it because it's so true.
So tell me more about this idea of helping people reorient this change. In the book, you talk about helping them find the commonplace.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
So commonplace, and this is like an ancient notion of rhetoric. So Aristotle talked about this idea of how do you create an environment where people feel they can change their mind or think differently. And coming around a commonplace is important because it's something that we can all agree on. So if we don't agree on X versus Y, what's the Z? What's the thing that we can say, okay, at least we value this? And so often that comes back to values. You know, what are the core values you've got that even if you disagree with me on an issue, at the end of the day, there's a lot we do agree on. And sometimes we focus so much on the things we don't agree on that we miss the things that actually we hold in common. And how do you start there? And so that can be in any sort of situation, you can call that out in the other person. And you can say, look, like, I know you're someone who really values thinking clearly and being up to date. And like, I get it because I'm exactly the same. And I'm pretty sure, like, knowing you, I know you'd want to hear this. You're just prefacing it in a way that you're acknowledging who they are, the way they think, what they value. You share that value, and then you're sharing your perspective. Some of this is also about presenting ideas in a way that makes people feel like they can step into that common space without feeling again like they've been bullied or coerced. And so one of the encouragements I give to clients and to audiences is, like, don't upsell your ideas, unsell them. And so rather than giving all the brilliant perspectives and arguments and logic and rational data as to why what you're suggesting is a good idea, or even, you know, if you're talking to your teenage kids, a reason why, you know, as a parent, you know this is true, and in time they'll come to see the light that you are actually right after all. That, of course, triggers defiance. And so if you unsell it and like you preface an idea or a perspective with things like, you know, I could be way off here. Look, my sense is that, and hey, take this for what it's worth, but. And yet we often go into conversations almost using language that sets people on edge. Like, hey, don't take any offense, but, or you may not want to hear this, but, you know, it's funny how like we preface our very arguments and perspectives in ways that many people aren't willing to step into that commonplace and rally around things that we can agree on. So much of it's about the posture you have as you come into a conversation too.
Yeah, I like that idea of leveling the field so that you're almost approaching as a partner and not as someone who's trying to wield power in this conversation. Correct. So the decision to change really starts as a decision to trust. And one of the ways to get others to go along with us is to go along with them, literally go along with them. And you talk about some really interesting research in the book about the power of taking a walk with someone to get in sync. How does that work exactly?
Yeah, so this goes right back to, you know, again, Aristotle's foundations of rhetoric. So you had the three of them was logos, pathos, and ethos. So logos about speaking to rational faculties, essentially. Pathos speaking to the heart. Ethos was about trust and credibility. And so much of what we miss today when it comes to persuading others is that last piece, you know, ethos, building ethos with the other person. So there's a lot of great research around what it is that actually causes the release of a hormone called oxytocin, which is our body's social bonding hormone, incredibly powerful, and it's like the foundation for influence to occur. Once oxytocin is released, that's that signal of trust. I'm now willing to listen to you, to engage with you. I feel safe with you. So some really interesting practical ways to do this. I mean, there's lots of things you can do around, you know, being really authentic. Self-deprecation is really powerful. You know, that unselling idea we talked about before. But the really simple one I loved coming across in some of the research for this book came from some work from Professor Paul Zak, who's a professor at Claremont Graduate School. And he talked about the power of going for a walk. Because what happens when you walk side by side with someone, you get in sync. And if you look at brain scans, synchronicity between two people, and it can be anything. I mean, it can be, you know, people singing in a choir, incredible oxytocin release when there's that sense of togetherness. We're trusting, we're in a trusting environment, we're trusting others. That's created by doing something in sync, like singing or clapping or dancing. Now, if you're having a tricky conversation with someone in your team, starting it with a, hey, can we clap together for 5 seconds? I'd love to just, you know, get in sync. That's going to be awkward. So like going for a walk is great because it does the same thing. When you go for a walk with someone side by side, you match their cadence, you get in step. When that happens, that sense of a mind meld or a brain connection, the oxytocin release, means they're far more likely to be open to what it is you're suggesting. Now, you've got to be careful not to use this as a tool of manipulation, and that's the case with any of this stuff. But if you're doing with this with good intention, a desire to genuinely have a win-win, walking side by side, go for a walk. Don't just sit opposite someone at over the desk in the office or at a cafe table. Get out, go for a walk, and you'll find the conversation will flow far more easily because trust will be built.
Another persuasion gem that you have in the book, and I've been using it with our teens, and it's ridiculously effective, is the rate and reflect technique.
Yeah.
This has been a game changer in our house. Take us through that.
Yeah, so this actually comes from some work that a number of professors have done, particularly a group at Yale University. The classical term for this, for those who are listening and want to go a little bit deeper and look at the sort of the research back end of this, it's called motivational interviewing. And so motivational interviewing has been used for over 3 decades to deal with really problematic behaviors like alcohol abuse, drug abuse, gaming or gambling abuse, all these addictions. And so what it does is it's based on using 2 specific questions in a specific order. So I just call it rate and reflect because, I wanted to make it really accessible and easy for just everyday, non-academic-y sort of people. So rate and reflect, the 2 questions you use. First question is, for a scale of 1 to 10, how open or willing would you be to, and then fill in the blanks, whatever it is that you're asking the person to consider, the suggestion that you're making. And typically, if you're dealing with someone who's stubborn, who doesn't want to consider what you're suggesting, they'll give you a lowball number. It'll be a 2 or a 3. And that's fine. So don't get discouraged if you hear a low number in response to the first question, because the second question is where the magic happens. And the second question then becomes this. Okay, that's cool. I get that. But I'm just curious, how come you didn't give a lower number? Because in that moment, you've reframed the entire conversation. Now it's not about all the reasons you don't want to do what I'm suggesting or consider what I'm proposing. It's now like, what's the small part of you that can see there might be benefit, there might be value in this? And more importantly, it's your own motivation, something that inherently is already there within you, rather than feeling like you've got to do it because it's been suggested to you. And so this again comes back to the common place. What's the common place? Let's say you're a 2 or 3 out of 10. There's a small part of you that agrees with the person who's suggesting something to you. That's a common place, that ideological. We're on the same page here. Let's start from there. And so it's a really powerful technique if you use it well.
So there's this cliche we throw around all the time, save the best for last. And that's how we get our kids to, eat dinner before dessert. But when it comes to persuasion, you actually argue that this sequence of how we stage and arrange our ideas really does matter. Is that right?
It does, absolutely. So the person who's done probably the best research on this is Adam Galinsky, who's based at Columbia University. And what he's looked at is the role that sequence plays. So if you are, for instance, in a competitive lineup, let's say you're pitching for funding for a startup, or you're pitching an idea and you've got 3 or 4 other people who are pitching that idea to your executive team. And you see this in like talent contests, be it things like American Idol or The Voice or even Eurovision, any of these contests where you are in an order. If you can try and be at the end of the list, that's often the best place to be, because if you are early in the list, what the judges are actually doing is they're judging your ideas, your proposal, your suggestion by their ideal imagined contestant, which is often never a fair comparison. And then as they go on, once you get to the second, third, 5th person, they're starting to get a sense of what's the average, what's the mean here. And then ideally, if you can be at the end and you can do well, that doing well will actually stand out in comparison with the mean of the group. But also the law of recency kicks in here. So when they're making a decision at the end, whoever they heard from most recently is overweighted in terms of the impact that has. So if you have the choice, certainly be at the end. Then you could be at the beginning if you're confident you can present really well and really knock it out of the park, because then you essentially you're like the anchor for the group. You can actually anchor with this is what normal is. But in the middle is where things get difficult. So now that's hard to stand out in the middle. So either at the end is ideal or at the beginning, but not in the middle, if you can choose where you'll be in the sequence. And these are just simple things that have a huge impact on how you are perceived and your ideas are perceived. So if you want to see them in the best light or perceived in the best light, sequence makes a difference.
Yeah. So saving the best for last, saving your best ideas for last, even saving your best presentation for last can really make all the difference.
Yeah.
The book is Unstuck, and the author, and he's opened a few minds today in this conversation, is Michael McQueen. Michael, thank you for sharing your wish with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Cheers.